must say, I wrote that piece for a project that was supposed to honor Africans who worked on rice plantations in South Carolina. So I wanted to, as much as possible, kind of connect to the ancestors, and there was a lot going on. My mother had Parkinson's, and I was spending a lot of time there, so she was fine when I was writing this, but I just kept thinking about my lineage. So I wanted to, really kind of hone in on, really expressing something. And like you said, just hearing it here is really powerful. So.
But you did mention, and I'd like to kick it over to you, Dr. Hadley, you mentioned the notion of resistance and what the music embodied in terms of resistance. Could either of you speak to that, so this longer tradition of resistance in African American music, and what this means in the context of classical music?
I think there are lots of ways to think about resistance. One, in a system of oppression, particularly of enslavement, just the ability to live and go on is an act of resistance. But what we find in Black music is both this balance of resistance and affirmation, reminding oneself of one's own humanity in a system and in a place that frequently says the opposite, that one is not human, one is property, one is 3/5 of, one is less than, right? And so what leapt out at me in all of these pieces, and I was thinking about with Juba and what you said about resistance, is that with classical music in particular, I find it for composers of African descent to continue in that lineage. In other words, of using music to affirm history as well, to enshrine history. And you spoke about incorporating a melody from Burundi. You spoke about a tradition of lining hymns, which comes out of Black Protestant churches, which is a tradition that's fading away, right? Because the people who do it are now passing on, but we have it enshrined in the composition. And so that idea of saying, composers frequently say, and Dorothy Rudmore is certainly in this, squarely in this lineage as an alumna of Howard University at HBCU and a founder of the Society of Black Composers, of making sure that these stories, and that piece is dedicated to Martin Luther King, transition, the last piece we heard, of making sure that it's history, this affirmation that we are people with a history, with a present, with a future. Classical music then became this really important opportunity to write that down in long-lasting ways. Some people wrote those histories down in books or in essays, but composers gave us those histories in the pieces that they wrote. And when we listen, and some of the lines in yours, I grew up Baptist. My daddy, my granddaddy, all lined hymns. It literally, like, kind of goosebumps about that tradition and how I was hearing the melodies and what you wrote. And so all of that notion of resistance, and for me, is in balance with affirmation, that it is a tandem idea that we hear clearly ring through all of the music that we heard tonight.
I mean, it's interesting because I was thinking about asking the question around what are the commonalities, or what's the through line through all these pieces. So thanks for bringing that out. I think part of the, when we were talking earlier, part of what I was thinking about also was, the presence of Black composers in the classical music context. Why is it important that these African traditions, the African American traditions, are found and seen and written into the canon? What is the significance of it?
And played.
What is the significance of this music in the broader canon, the broader musical lineage?
Well, I can say you mentioned something that Fredara, that my first composition teacher, T.J. Anderson, fantastic African-American composer and scholar, he always said to me, you need to document the tradition, document the culture. So in writing the music, you're documenting the culture. And that's always been the case. That's the case. Bach was documenting his culture. Mozart was documenting his culture. Clara Schumann was documenting her culture. And I think that it's important in America to acknowledge this, because I'm sure some of you are aware of the fact that Antonin Dvorak, important Czech composer, was brought to New York to encourage American composers to write American music. And more recently, I found, I guess, the last interview he did on this subject, which was probably published when he returned to Europe in 1895. And he said, look, I know I'm not from there, but I know that the music of those black people who use Negro is the music that you all listen to. And I know you talk about Stephen Foster, but his music is also black music. So whatever music that everyone responds to in your culture is you. And I think that's kind of an important aspect of your question. You know, who are we as Americans? I mean, we listen to a lot of different music, but that contribution, you know, the stomping the foot might seem a little bizarre, but it's connected to what you hear in rock drumming and in jazz drumming. It's part of kind of our American lingua franca. Some of the blue notes, the Beatles use those blue notes, you know, Earth, Wind, and Fire use those blue notes. It's part of how we hear music. So classical music, like in every culture, in France, in Spain, has that opportunity to document who we are musically as a people. I think that's the powerful thing.
It's interesting. You know, you mentioned the notion of who we are as a people, and Dr. Hadley, in your work, you talk a lot about the ability of African American music to create notions of one community, and the other thing you mentioned earlier was kind of joy in a sense of being. And I was thinking about this a piece that you wrote about Aretha Franklin in the Washington Post I was recently reading. Could you say a little bit about that in terms of the ability of music to create community and create spaces for joy?
One of the things when we're talking about Black participation and presence in classical music, a lot of the attention understandably goes to the composers, but what I also think we should keep in view is that there's a long history of community practice by African Americans in classical music, you know, and so meaning that you had ensembles, you had choirs, you had music teachers, you had really well-trained and talented musicians in these communities, people who just got together and sang pieces because that's what they wanted to do. And so this whole notion that, you know, Black participation in classical music has to be an alienating thing in a lot of ways is a recent idea, because classical music alongside folk spirituals, alongside the blues, was one of those things that gathered people together. And so, you know, whether we're thinking about Aretha Franklin, one of the things that I wrote in that piece, or I was thinking about when I wrote that piece, is how the day that she died, I went to the Apollo Theater in Harlem, because that's where you go when famous Black people die. They put the name, in case you didn't know, that's where you go. They put the person's name on the marquee, and they bring out the speakers, and they blast the music for hours and hours. It was all of these Black women who were like my mother's age, could be my aunts in that peer group, who were singing along and weeping and crying and holding each other at the memory of Aretha and the music that she created. But the same is also true when I was a little girl. My parents would take me to go see the Fish Jubilee Singers when they came to town, the Morehouse Glee Club when they came to town, or Alan Ailey when they came to town. And so Black music's ability to reflect the entirety of one's experience as being one of African descent is unmatched in a lot of ways. Even what people can't necessarily articulate with words, they feel. So in the libation ceremony we had to open up this program, you know, I could feel, unfortunately I've been to Ghana in the slave dungeons, but like, even if you haven't, like that ancestral memory, that sense of lineage, that sense of, I don't have to be who you say I am because I have been, right? Is at the heart of what the music is doing, the efficacy of its ability to reach beyond and call forth and gather, right? The drums are so important because they cut through. He said it was a talking drum, a means of communication. And the timbre of the djembe in particular is so clear that it can travel. And so you hear it even before you see it. And its ability to, the foot stomping, again, is something that cuts through, right? And so the music's ability to do all of those things is for me, in my estimation, the heart of its ingenuity and its power.
Interesting you mentioned the slave dungeons in Ghana, because last week at Weeksville we had the Minister of Tourism. Just happened to stop by.
He was in town. Yeah.
Hey, he's coming by 12. Can you make it? Sure. Tell him to come by. So gave him a tour, but took him into the houses. The houses were built in the mid-19th century. And you're talking about this memory and the connection that they felt. You know, they obviously know the dungeons in Ghana, that's where they're from, and then coming into the houses, coming to the free community of Vicksville, kind of felt that connection. So it really just speaks to really how powerful culture is and how it's transmitted, without words, and really the feeling that's emitted from sacred spaces and sacred cultural practices and through music. So thanks for bringing that up. But I'm wondering, what is the future? What does the bench look like for composition, for Black composers in classical music?
I can say there is a very deep bench now. It's amazing. I mean, really, I went to UC Berkeley, California, and I didn't know there weren't many African American performers that I knew, and now there's a plethora of performers. They're fantastic composers. There are people who are just getting recognized, like Anthony Davis, who won the Pulitzer, but he's been writing, and I'm so looking forward to seeing Terence Blanchard opera. I'm also looking forward to Malcolm X, which I've been in love with for a long time, by Anthony Davis. And I think that I'm going on what you said, Kadera. African Americans have been writing classical music for a long time. Before modern gospel existed, African Americans were playing classical music. The person who taught Manus, who created the Manus School, to play the violin was an African American violinist. Right? He wrote an opera, Queen's Ball, I think that's the name. But so it's not a new thing. So what is fantastic to see now is that there are all of these young composers, people like Courtney Bryan and Jesse Montgomery, Carlos Simon. I mean, it's really, and I'm going to miss a lot of people, but that's the issue. There are a lot of people I can miss. Now, though T.J. Anderson, Ollie Wilson, Dorothy Wedmore, there's that generation, and they were all around too, Hale Smith. But I think the difference now is that these composers are becoming more visible, and I think people want to hear what they have to say.
To that point, events like tonight, where you actually get to hear these pieces. Classical music, we're really concerned with the canon, and how you get into the canon is through repetition. People are playing your work, and that your work is published, right? And so it is about institutions really stepping up to the plate to make sure at every juncture that the pieces and the parts, the score and the parts are available, right? So that students can learn them, that they incentivize people to make them pieces for competitions, that they're pieces that are being taught, they're pieces that are being heard. And thankfully, that is work that Juilliard has taken up, and other institutions as well. And so, I'm hopeful, I'm cautiously optimistic that we will continue to hear more of these pieces that have been around, right? And we're really excited for all of the enthusiasm around Florence Price. But there are so many others that we should be listening to as well. And I think that helps to buoy our living Black composers to know that their pieces will be heard.
I'm just curious. Are we in a moment right now, because of where we are socially and politically, that there's attention to this, to Black composers and music, and how long do you think the window is going to stay open?
Listen, we're going to try to get it all in for as long as
Comments? Anybody have any questions or thoughts, comments?
You all are wonderful. God bless you, and thank you for keeping the culture alive. I was stomping with the music, with the fiddle, and I was like, I got that. That's in my DNA. I know that.
Yes.
So thank you guys for all that you do and all the important education you're giving to everybody. So continue to be blessed.
Ashe.
Ashe.
I have a question. When you wrote that piece, did you include any additional instruments? Because I know it was a bit.
Oh, when I wrote so it was originally for string orchestra. So the only missing instrument was a double bass. And after I wrote that, I thought, I think I should make a string quartet version of it. But no, nothing else. One really important point is that classical music education for everyone has diminished in kind of K through 12 education. So that's just the reality. I see that as someone who teaches music theory. There are people who are musicians, but they didn't have a lot of theory because a lot of schools cut the theory, which means they're not focusing on it. So I think maybe we should rethink, issues in maybe just the Black community, because it's hard to find it anywhere that you have school systems that are actually investing in that. That said, there are programs like the MAP program at Juilliard, which I teach in, and pre-college, and there are a lot of students of color who participate in that program. And I think that there's always been, going back to what you were talking about with Aretha Franklin, the schools. So there's always been an emphasis on performance of all sorts of music in the Black community. So that is always there and will always be there. But I think, I think in general, I think we need to do more. If we want people to appreciate it, then we need to actually include it earlier in their education. Yeah, that's what I mentioned.
Yes, Terrence Blanchard's Fire Shut Up in My Bones with libretto by Cassie Lemons just opened this past Monday, and it's, for everyone's knowledge, it's the first opera by a Black composer ever to be performed at the Metropolitan Opera in its 138th year history. So, and hopefully not the last. Well, Malcolm X is coming next week.
But interesting fact, William Grant Still wrote an opera called Troubled Island that was the first commissioned or new opera to be premiered by City Opera in 1949. And I guess that's the issue. It's always been there, but not the access, and hopefully we have a deep bench.
And we have a deep bench. I think that might be a good point to end on. Is that all right, everybody? Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.